This episode is brought to you by 10 Yetis Digital. We started using these guys at the beginning of the year and we've had great results. They're an online public relations agency that manage influencer marketing campaigns, social media campaigns, design. They do design, and they cover sort of multiple sectors, brands big and small. Highly recommended. That's 10yetis.co.uk. Welcome to the Tech Leaders Podcast. I wanted to get somebody on the show who could provide some perspective on this inevitable macro shift towards remote working and the impact of that across sectors and the workplace in general. This guy is completely qualified to talk on this subject. He runs an enormous portfolio of commercial property. He's a tech investor, set up iGabriel when he was just 21. So we talk about this journey and lots of other associated subjects, including a charity he's involved with, an amazing charity he's involved with, and also a very unique residential rental company that he set up called Uncle, and they essentially combine collaborative workspace with the living space. So it's a really clever concept, and it seems to be doing really well. It's a really interesting conversation. It's Ryan Prince. Ryan Prince, thank you for coming on the show. I'm really excited about this one. I know we took a while to get this going. I know you're a very busy chap, I'm super
glad we can get it together. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I just wanted to start off with you just giving a bit of an intro to yourself, a broad overview of your sort of career journey and what you're doing right now.
Sure. Intro to myself. So I guess a real intro to myself is I was born and raised in Canada, Toronto. My father and his parents came over after the Second World War, shortly after the Second World War. So first they were, I guess I'm second generation. They were immigrants into the country. My mother's family was one generation before that, or maybe 20 years before that. And grew up in Toronto, went to school there, and then did my undergraduate studies just outside of Toronto at a school called University of Western Ontario, which is actually is in a city called London, Ontario, ironically.
Oh, I know it, yeah.
London, Ontario is a beautiful, almost a North American style big campus. So, 25,000 students, big campus, very, very cold most of the year to get around, but beautiful in the spring for about 5 minutes. And I did my undergrad there in politics and commerce. I would work in the summers in the city, downtown on what we call Bay Street, would be the Toronto version of Wall Street, in various kind of investment banking type companies. And then after I graduated, pretty shortly after, applied for and was accepted to the London School of Economics to do a postgrad degree in finance. So I moved to London in 1998. I've been here ever since, and did a postgrad at LSE for about a year. I think it was a 10-month program. And that sort of got me embedded in London. And it was a pretty different experience, coming from University of Western Ontario, big campus, very social, lots of people around, lots of ways to meet new people. It was sort of what you'd see in a North American movie in lots of ways. Coming here in the city of London, LSE is a very small campus. It looks like one or two buildings on the Strand. There was one little pub, and that was kind of the whole story. And I came here not knowing a single person, and it didn't make it terribly easy to meet lots of people. Fortunately for me, there were 2 or 3 people in my course that I met and befriended, and that led to a lot of how I ended up staying here for a while.
Oh, cool. So, yeah, London can be quite a daunting, cold place, kind of, if you don't know anybody. But I think once you get going, it's probably...
I remember they used to have, sort of, believe it or not, in 98 was still fairly early days of mobile phones. And I remember walking by a mobile phone shop, and my dad came over with me when I was coming over here. And he said, should you get a mobile phone? And I looked at him, I said, what for? I don't know anyone and no one knows me. I don't know what I'd do with it.
No, definitely. So I read somewhere, Ryan, that you were a little bit
taken aback, and you saw an opportunity in the accommodation space, didn't you? There was not. You thought that the finding good accommodation was quite frustrating for you, and it give you the idea, which later in life led to you setting up Uncle. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I mean, well, there were lots of things that led to Uncle, and probably first and foremost, ultimately became my experience in the hotel business. But one of the things that I did observe in the UK was it significantly lagged my experience and what I'd seen in North America from a customer service point of view. So every step of doing anything here, I'd say back in those days, wasn't that long ago, but was a chicken and an egg. So if you wanted to rent a flat, you needed a reference from someone who lived here. But if you didn't know anyone, then how would you have that reference? And if you wanted if you wanted something else, you needed a bank account. But for a bank account, you needed to get a credit card. So it was all sort of circular and semi-impossible. I'll never forget my first shopping experience. I finally managed to sort out a flat. We went to John Lewis, and I bought, some bedding and some sheets and some towels and stuff, and spent, I don't know, an hour and a half in the store with this lovely clerk, who we get to the cashier's desk and they say, okay, that'll be whatever it was, 500 pounds or something. And I pull out my credit card and they say, we don't take credit cards.
Wow.
Like, well, you have a John Lewis account. I said, I just talked to you for an hour. I explained, I just moved here. I know I don't have a John Lewis account. I barely have a bank account. So that was like the perfect example of my experience here. Is you spend an hour and a half there, you get to the booth and you can't even pay.
Yeah. I remember that department stores a lot of them didn't used to take credit cards. They'd only take their own card. That sounds bizarre now, but
that was, everything was like that. It just felt like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were talking earlier on about when I moved to Canada. One thing I did notice is that hospitality and customer service in general was so much further ahead. That was in 2005. Even then, it was so much further ahead in North America than what it was in the UK.
Well, you still had this kind of, it was pre the first .com boom. And so there was still a real entrenched sense of English landed gentry-ism across the country. So, the landed estates, that whole oldie worldy posh Sloane Ranger, all that stuff was still very, very ensconced in what went on. Tatler magazine, I'm sure, was like the must-have thing that everybody would, want to understand what was going on in social circles. Yeah. And you had just, when I moved here, were in the middle phase of Cool Britannia, so that was just starting. But I don't think it was till the startup scene that you moved away from a lot of sort of a slightly more, it still has clear, huge social economic distortions here, but egalitarian view from a commercial business world point of view that young people and old people can be successful, smart, depending on where they were coming from. And that was not the case back then. So you really had that classic BA, the person in business class and first class is infinitely more important than the person in coach is, trash. That was certainly the psychology of the era.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was kind of pre the sort of, I think the startup thing, I think that was massively cultural. There was a massive cultural impact from that, wasn't it? I was talking to Luke Hakes from Octopus Ventures last week, actually, and we talked about this exact thing, about how after the dot-com bubble of the 2000s, I think obviously there was there was another wave of kind of modernization. A lot of people who lost a lot of money kind of put their money into new ventures and and everything started modernizing, and the UK became more of a tech hub, and entrepreneurialism became it had been in Silicon Valley for a while.
My experience in the tech startup scene, which was in that first wave, and I don't think, with some very minor exceptions, that psychology really changed until you got into that full second wave of, even as far as maybe 05, 06, it took for the VC culture to embrace failure and look to the positive attributes that can come from it.
I've had a conversation with a few people about this, about how the cultural difference in a business context between the US and the UK, and failure is not really seen as being, I say the US, I mean North America generally. I think Canada's pretty similar in this respect, but I mean, it's about how like if you go bankrupt or you fail, it's just seen as part of the journey for an American entrepreneur a lot of the time. Whereas in Britain, certainly at this time, failure was something to be avoided at all costs. Risk, to a certain extent, was something to be avoided at all costs. You know what I mean? So it's interesting how that's changed over the years.
I think that's right. And in some ways, I would argue that narrative, like all these things, has maybe swung a little bit far to the other side. So,
yes,
failure for its own sake is not necessarily a brilliant thing. If you've been an angel investor in early stage companies like I have, you're not hoping people fail and then are proud of them to fail to go on. So, I think valuing the idea that taking a risk and recognizing that a lot of risks don't come off is different than saying fail a lot, that's a brilliant thing to do. And I do think there's a subtle but very important difference, especially in the business world, that, I think that analogy is sometimes gets taken a little bit too far. You don't really want to start a business to fail. That's not actually that's not a good thing. But in and of itself, it shouldn't be the end of everything, which is where I think things were, 20 odd years ago.
No, absolutely. Let's go back to the chronology then, because you were telling us the story. I think you went up until, you were making some friends, the London School of Economics.
So what happened is I really liked London, didn't want to go back to Toronto, was probably 21 at the time. And just by fortune, one of the people who was one of my classmates at LSE was flatmates with a guy who it turned out had become at the time a bit of a doyen of the startup scene here in the UK, the very early startup scene. It was in network software, it was very hardcore kind of tech. First creation of virtual private networks, which obviously these days, everybody almost has on their laptops. At that point in time, the question was, how could you get a bank to prioritize its internet traffic between a trading software platform and a browser platform? And doing that was a big deal. So he and I met, got along really well. He was at the point where they were looking at taking his company public, and they were looking at a bunch of proceeds, and a lot of people kept coming to him looking at deals. And we talked a lot about investing. And he said to me, look, I really want someone as my partner who understands corporate finance and kind of the financial businessy side of things. I really understand tech and know lots of people. Is that something you do with me? And I thought, well, that sounds like an awful lot of fun. I have absolutely no real experience in anything you're describing. I'm flattered that you think that I do, but if you know all that and you still accept it and you want to do something together, I'd be happy to give it a shot. So, I had to figure out how I could still work here and all those good things that come with being young and just out of school. But we successfully managed to raise really one of the very first angel investment funds in the UK for tech at that time. So it was actually called iGabriel. It was the Archangel. And we structured it in a way which was, I still think, quite unique, which is all of our investors were only individuals who were founders or really senior executives of high growth, mostly technology media businesses. And the model was that they would all invest in a pool, and then that community of people would be the source of how we'd find opportunities, because people would come to them and they really didn't have the time or resource to do the work, meet the management teams, study the industry. And so the model was that any angel in the network had to sponsor a deal and co-invest and take a seat on the board in any investment that the fund did. And that was the insurance policy for all of the other investors in the group, that there was this endorsement factor. And I think the model, and that had existed in Silicon Valley for quite some time. Ron Conway and some other guys had started early stage angel groups in the Valley many years earlier, and there was definitely parallels, but certainly it didn't exist much in the UK. And that was really the model we started. And we were investing relatively small amounts of money, but we probably raised about 10 million euros in the first fund, which, as a 21-year-old, still is an awfully large amount of money, but, it was an even bigger amount of money to me 20 years ago. And we started investing that money in about 1998, 99. Found a lot of really interesting opportunities. We invested in probably what was the very first version of Deliveroo. Some guys came to us, and you have to remember, this is 99, so the iPhone didn't come out till 2007, just to give some context to where we were. You had just about had broadband in your office. There was absolutely no way broadband existed in your home. Phones were all SMS messages, and the rage at the time was premium rate SMS messages was about as sophisticated as mobile commerce got. So the idea was a bunch of guys driving around on scooters, delivering things, mostly driven through SMS messages. And again, this is pre-Google Maps. This is pre-anything like that. So we were very, very far ahead of the curve. And certainly one of the lessons you learn in investing is it's great to be early, but it's really bad to be too early. And we were definitely on a lot of things just too early.
Yeah. You were probably, well, sorry, what year was this?
99, 98, 99, 2000, 2001.
Yeah, because even Deliveroo and Uber Eats, when Uber Eats came after, actually, I think Just Eat and Deliveroo did struggle to market this category, even when they came into the market, which was...
Well, and that would have been in the teens, right? I mean, I can't imagine Deliveroo launched pre-2015, 16 at this point.
Yeah, funnily enough, I interviewed the CEO of Gusto.
Yep.
You know, Gusto, the meal preparation system, Steve Bolt, an interesting guy, and he was talking about how the entire challenge for him in the early days. And then, funnily enough, HelloFresh had launched in the same month of them, which was a complete coincidence. And the whole challenge for them was category marketing. They were just having to educate people. There was a curated meal preparation service available, and you don't have to go to the supermarket or the restaurant. There's something in between. And I mean,
yeah, so our era was more the era of, I mean, there was a huge amount of noise in the space. You'll remember most of them went bust. So it was when Amazon and eBay and those companies launched, but also, you know, probably still one of the biggest failed IPOs was Webvan, which was kind of the original grocery store delivered to your home. Was a perfect example of just too early.
I don't remember that. Was that
compare that to Ocado today, and Ocado's got a market value of 14 billion pounds.
Yeah, I saw that. That's crazy, which is more than a lot of the supermarkets, I think, isn't it? Which is crazy. But there we are. I mean, okay, so iGabriel obviously started in 99 then, yeah? And
yeah, started in 99, and then we invested the money, and I think we were in the middle of the first tech wreck, but actually a bunch of investors really saw promise in what we were doing. And so at the time, large organizations, institutional investors, even at the time we were talking to the European Investment Bank, who said, how about we seed you, I think it was about 50 million euros to go do the next fund and keep pressing on with this idea. They clearly had an overarching social mission, an innovation mission about fostering entrepreneurship and growing the culture. And we were really a great, very credible way of doing that. So that was around 2001, 2002. And right around that time, I think I just about turned 25, or was just about to turn 25. And I realized a couple of things when we were doing early stage investing. The first thing I realized was it takes, at that time, like 10 plus years to see if something's worked. You really just don't know. And the roller coaster is immense. There are lots of ups and downs and loop-de-loops along the way. And in the style of investing that we were doing, we were minority shareholders, very minority. I mean, we were owning 5 to 15% of a business when we went into these companies. And invariably, they would have some monster down round at 1 or 2 points in their life. And we really just weren't well enough capitalized to follow that money and make those bets along the way. And also, you wouldn't know where you were. So I took a view that said, okay, I'm 25. I won't know if any of this works till I'm 35. I have no control at all. The entrepreneurs you were backing, almost by definition, were still mostly first-time entrepreneurs. So you had very little in the way of being able to assess. In the US, you'd look and go, well, that guy's done it 3 times before. And I'm saying that guy, I mean, at the time, the world has changed a lot, but it was actually mostly, it's still a very male-dominated industry with some great positive changes that have happened since. But at that point in time, it was just all guys. And it was hard to see, do you want to place, a bet for the next 10 years of your life on somebody that has no evidence that they're going to succeed, which wasn't the case in the US. And at the time, I took the decision that that was not a direction of my life, that when I eventually would get married or have a family, that was sufficient to me to put food on the table. So I decided not to go do that second fund. we merged iGabriel with a larger group of angel investors, which was called Pi Capital, and took back a position in that larger entity. And at that time, I took a step back from iGabriel and went on my own.
You went on your own tech investing, or?
Well, I went on my own, I would say, in the virtual garden. There was no, I went back to, I had the office. We had this amazing office in the Michelin building. I don't know if you've ever been there in Sloan Square. It was incredible. One of our angels, their office was there, and so they gave us some space. It was the most incredible space.
In Sloan Square, you said, yeah?
It was in Brompton Cross, actually.
Oh, okay, I know, yeah.
Just up from there. And and so I took some time to think about what we wanted to do or what I wanted to do. And at the time, you know, I had grown up, my family's background in Canada, or my father's, had been around investing in real estate. He was a lawyer by background. And he came over for my 25th birthday to celebrate and said to me, why don't you have a look at real estate? And I said, well, it's because I really don't know the first thing about real estate. At this point, I had this great network of people all around technology. And he said, well, you know, you don't remember, but I took you around since you're 5 years old, the buildings. You know more than you think, and it's not that complicated anyway. And so at the time I said, okay, well, look, let me give it a year. I'll have a go of it. Let's set out what exactly that means in terms of what is investing in real estate. What does that look like? I mean, I did come from a corporate finance background, so I did understand numbers pretty well. And I'll, like anything, I'll give it 12 months and see where I get. So that's what I did. So April 2002, I set up business. I basically appropriated the company's name that my dad and a partner had set up in Canada. It's called Realstar. I made at that time, even 2002, I made a brochure. Wasn't even a website. Don't think I got to a website till probably 04, 05. That I would then go around and started, you know, from scratch, seeing lenders, advisors, brokers to talk through what opportunities might look like. And I had no idea where I would land, but I just sort of thought I'd try and figure out the lay of the land. So that's really where Realstar started. And the idea was give it 12 months and see what happened. And I sort of always look at business from the view of, there's this great saying in Canadian hockey, the most famous hockey player probably ever is called Wayne Gretzky. And Wayne Gretzky has a saying that who knows how it came about, but
I know what you're going to say here. Go on.
Gretzky always said the secret to success is skating to where the puck was going, not where it was. And so I always used to think about, when I started in the business, about thinking about what was everybody doing, and then what weren't they doing? Like what was overlooked, looked down on. I always kind of liked sort of the underdog. So what was the thing that people would sniff their nose at? Wasn't sexy, didn't look great, didn't sound great. What were those things? And those were the areas that maybe there was some value to be found, especially in an industry like real estate, which is so hyper competitive, filled with so many entrepreneurial people for so long. So from some young person who's coming out of nowhere, how am I ever going to find something that's worthwhile and where I have some kind of an edge? And so that's really where I focused my attention, was anything that was alternative.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, I landed on discovering this little corner of the market, which was doctor's surgeries. And I ended up discovering this little market where essentially the government is de facto your tenant, but it's really not that obvious. And you're in a sector which is healthcare, which I thought felt pretty resilient. And the income streams look pretty stable. So going back to my original thought about trying to get into a space that I could, you know, create a life for myself that seemed reasonably reliable, that's where I found. And I found a company where I ultimately ended up finding a company where the partners had fallen out. Where they got to was they wanted to sell. And I just happened to be, you know, there in the right place at the right time, done enough homework to understand the space. And so 6 months after having set up shop, managed to borrow, I mean, I think we borrowed 90%. I mean, find a lender who wanted to lend against this income and buy our first real estate portfolio, September, October, that following year, having set up in that same year, having set up in June or April, I think.
So that must have been quite exciting. And so all of a sudden,
Yeah, I was like, all of a sudden I felt like I was in
massive
business and I was a real person, and we had these assets, and I would drive. I mean, and these, and from there on, I spent the next 2 or 3 years literally driving across the country, because doctor surgeries are small and they are all over the place. So, I mean, I remember one day I took a train up to Blackpool, drove down to Preston and Lancashire, through Crewe and back to London for dinner, all in a day. I mean, it was
that's a long way.
I always joke, for someone with my accent, I know more places in this country than most people you'd meet in the street.
So just going on the property thing for now then, and then we can dive back into the tech stuff. But I mean, I just wanted to ask you about, obviously, Realstar. It was very successful and went on to have a massive portfolio. And then you set up Uncle, didn't you? Which a residential sort of concept brand. Is that what it is in terms of?
Yeah. So Uncle is essentially, I mean, so after we did that, we did one big thing, which is, after owning the business, having started the business for a year, I found a deal where we bought 73 Holiday Inns across the whole of the UK for £1 billion.
Wow.
So we had started the business in 2002. In the first quarter of 2005, we bought £1 billion of hotels in just about every city in the UK. And we owned and oversaw that portfolio for about 12 years. So we went from effectively 0 to 100 in 2 seconds from a corporate point of view. And that portfolio really served as the anchor for most of my education in lots of different things: operating businesses, brands, real estate, tech, because the hotel business is filled with technology and lots of different aspects and silos. And we own that business through the 08, 09, 10 recession, came out the other side, ultimately sold it in 2014 and 15. And it ended up being a really successful investment in the end, with an MBA's worth times, a multitude of experiences in the middle. And that really was the core of the business here for a large portion of time. Coming out of that, I had the realization in the residential space, which was a large part of the Canadian business this whole time, that nobody had married what hospitality does around brand and brand goodwill and brand loyalty in the residential rental space. And I thought that that was true actually globally. So despite the fact that in some cases, there was a business model that lots of people do, which is look at what works elsewhere in the world and import it into the UK market. Actually, when you looked at the rental housing space, there was no brand writ large anywhere, including the US, bizarrely.
Yeah.
And so Uncle was born out of the idea that here is a sector that is critically important to 40-50% of people who live in urban cities in the world. People need brands as a certificate of trust, which is essentially what a brand is. And where do you want trust more than in the place you live and spend 30, 40, 50% of your income? And yet, actually, there was no brand at all in existence in that world. And so from that, the concept really of Uncle was born.
Yeah, that's. Do you know what? The reason I didn't tell you this, but that's how I found you. Was I used to stay in New Cross quite a lot. Before all the crazy stuff happened, and one of the guys in our company has got a flat down there, so I just stayed there when I was in London, and I walked past this. I was walking down to New Cross station from New Cross Gate station because the trains were delayed or something, and I just saw it, Uncle, in big massive writing, and I thought, wow, that looks amazing, and I loved the branding, and so I just Googled it when I was waiting for the train. I was like, what the hell is this? And that's where I come across you. But I mean, what struck me was this, and this is something that I'm really interested in, is that you had a co-working space as part of the accommodation, didn't you? It was a kind of like a WeWork bolted onto an apartment.
I think it's actually broader than that, and I think that COVID has brought this, magnified at a 10x, which is how people live is going to be more important now than it ever has been before. And what I think the pandemic has changed is, if not, it's hard to know what long-term changes there will be from this. It's impossible to predict. But one of the things I think that one can say with certainty changed is stigma around working from home when you're not a gig economy worker has changed forever as a result of the last 2 to 3 months. And the idea that people will want to work from home and that companies will accept that you can do the job as effectively, in some cases, if not more effectively, from your home than from the office, is going to be the case now forevermore, or for the foreseeable future. And therefore, what that means is the amenities and facilities that are available to you from home become way more important than they ever were 6 months ago. So going to co-working, I would say when we started the brand was really tailoring to one particular or two particular types of our residents, but not the entire building. It was tailored to residents in the gig economy and, to a lesser extent, students who lived in the buildings. And now I think those spaces will be for every single person in the building. So, and I think the same will be true of our wellness spaces. How many people want to go to gyms or things like that versus, again, you have a trusted provider and uncle who looks after it. The team, that they'll maintain it, they'll clean it, what their policies are. I think all of those wellness, mental, physical aspects of life are going to come squarely into focus. And buildings like Uncle's that were designed that way in some ways to accommodate different requirements 2 years ago are actually, ending up becoming even more important. It's a bit like our conversation earlier about Zoom. Zoom was created for a perfectly good reason and had its own demand pre-pandemic, but the universe of users and how that's changed has changed a lot as a result of it. And in some ways, I think our buildings have similar parallels that way.
I can see multiple reasons why the concept you're talking about, the buildings that you create and the service that you create, is going to get more and more popular post-pandemic. But the main one that springs to mind is because you're essentially, people have become more defensive of their time, haven't they? And you think about it in the old world a couple of months ago, people spend, in London, you could easily spend 2 hours commuting a day to get to a physical location. Yeah. And then another, 20 minutes going back and forth to a gym. If they lived in one of your places and they could work in the co-working space, they could have a gym downstairs, then they could be so much more productive and have more time back that they can then spend at their own leisure. Do you see what I mean?
Well, and not even just in the co-working space. I mean, I do think 75-80% of our spaces are the apartments themselves. So going back, that the quality of your own home, the place you actually live, the furniture, the appliances, the spaces, the outdoor spaces, all take on a different level of importance, because yes, you may want to choose to work in a co-working space, but actually probably a lot of the time you just want to work in your own place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what do those rooms look like? How are they set up? What furniture do you have? How good quality is that? When it used to basically be a dorm where you just come home and use it as a bed, you might have cared to a certain level. If you want to work from home 2 or 3 days a week, the surrounding environment in your apartment become elevated in terms of their importance.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. That's really exciting. So have you got, what are the plans then for Uncle and this concept? Are you going to build them? Are you building more around London at the moment? I noticed you opened one recently.
We just opened our most recent one in Wembley just 10 days ago. It's 2 towers just right between Wembley Stadium and Wembley Central Station, so it's really accessible. That building is about 240 apartments, mix of 1, 2, 3 bed apartments. Furniture-wise, we did a partnership with a Danish furniture company called Beau Concepts. So the idea behind the brand, we have this idea about renting as it should be, and I think what it should be, the word should, is really different for everybody. So you may want it furnished, I may want it unfurnished to bring all my other things. So we offer that choice to whomever they want. We will have all these different kinds of amenities. We've done a partnership with Peloton, so now we'll have a Peloton studio in all of our buildings. everybody's got used to Pelotons in lockdown or would like to get used to Pelotons in lockdown. There's space for mindfulness and introspection. So we put in these specialized meditation studios. The gym is bigger and more modern than we've had in our other spaces. And then from a technology point of view, what we've learned from lockdown is how to adapt to social distancing and to enable you to have, again, flexibility using technology. So you can now visit our property through a virtual 3D tour. You can visit our property through a remote viewing, which is one of our live on site teams who will show you around using a device, and you have this kind of experience. Or you can come in and now you're allowed to in person with appropriate social distances, physically look around. And so having all that range of choice and using technology to do that, even when you move in, now we've got what we call contactless move-ins. So all the things I would have told you in person are now delivered on little vignette videos that you can look at your leisure. And so it's all done in that kind of way.
Yeah, I read recently about the pandemic situation is not really changing anything, but it's just accelerating the change that was already going to happen. And so in the context of, this thing that you talked about, people, working from home is no longer, it's becoming mainstream, and the lines are blurring between, work and life, if that makes sense. The work-life balance thing is becoming more important, and I suppose that's what you're playing to in the creation.
Yeah, and I think there's this really nice thing that may come out of it, which is people met most of their colleagues. You go to school, you maybe make some friends at school, and then you go off into the workplace, and probably that's your largest network of people to meet. Where you never met people was the place you lived. There's just doors and they're anonymous. Part of the mission behind Uncle has always been to create a neighborhood. I've always worried a little bit about the word community, but we've definitely liked the word neighborhood. And so, our resident managers are, one of the things they do when you move into a building and is to knock on the neighbors' doors when the day you move in and introduce you to your neighbors. Say, this is Gareth, here's what he does. This is, Susie and Mary, and this is what they do. You may want to just recognize faces. And if you want to, and they say, hey, look, if you need a, sugar or whatever it is, I'm always here, knock on the door, whatever it is. Yeah. So that has always been the idea. I think as people spend more and more time at home, that idea of adding a whole other universe of potential people to know in your life gets expanded. So in some ways, you've got the work canteen for lunch, but what you're going to end up having is lunch with a bunch of people who you don't work with, but who you live with as part of the new world that we live in. And I think that that's really interesting and positive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what's your forecast on the commercial sort of office space, like what WeWork are doing and stuff like that? How do you see that changing?
I think to a certain extent, it's going to largely depend on what the ultimate space protocols end up being. 2 meter, how many people, how much space. And then different companies will end up making different decisions around that. Do you run shifts? Do you take, in some cases where the companies need to be there, do they just end up taking more space to accommodate that? So I think it'll be a mix. Definitely the one that I haven't really thought through is high-rise buildings and how do you get everybody up to the space?
Yeah.
And so I think only time will tell how that works and what comfort levels become. I mean, my own hypothesis is that the world is going to evolve to a place where they adapt to the risks and understand the risks of pandemics.
Yeah.
People who are highest risk will be told to isolate or do things at their own risk. But like you go to a car park and it's like, leave your valuables in the car at your own risk. People will understand their risks, understand the exposures, and be offered choice. And people who are at low risk will end up deciding to take some of those risks. And I think that will be a gradual introduction, but ultimately, I think the world we've been living in for the last 2 to 3 months is not a sustainable model for living. No. And it's not a desirable model for living. I think if the rules of the game were to be alive till you're 80 years old, stay in your house till you're 80 years old, a lot of people just don't see that as living life. And so what's the point of living life if it's to stay behind, your own door for the rest of it? And so that will take some time to adjust to in terms of what the choices are, but I suspect that's where we're going to end up.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I just wanted to move on to the sort of moving away from the office space stuff onto the tech investment again very quickly. Are you still involved? Are you still investing in tech businesses these days? Are you putting most of your energy into the property stuff? Or
I definitely put my day job into the property stuff, and the tech as it evolves around doing that. So my tech skills have always come into form, whether it was in the hotel business or in the uncle business, around how does technology facilitate and may either operationally or from a customer experience point of view improve what we're doing, and that always comes to bear in what we're doing in Uncle.
yeah,
And then from a personal point of view, I mean, I'm an investor in a co-working business. Actually, I'm sort of a board observer in one, and then I've personally invested as an angel in numerous technology businesses. I would say mostly consumer-facing technology businesses, just because that's probably what I've been able to get my head around. I'm not sure that's been the smartest thing to do, but at least in the universe of do what you know, I'm able to feel a little more comfortable about assessing consumer demand than I am um, inherent sort of hardcore tech, and how smart one, silicon wafer chip is versus another. Even if I saw that opportunity, I would have zero ability to form a view. So they've been more consumer-led things. Like I say, co-working, mattresses, makeup, all those kinds of things have been things I've personally invested in.
what are you most excited about in your portfolio at the moment?
Well, actually, I'm probably most excited. I'm an investor in a makeup brand called Trini London, which was founded by Trini Woodall, who's a
I know, yeah.
television
What
person.
not to wear?
What not to wear, yeah.
Yeah.
And that brand has done really well through this, and they've now started marketing virtual consultations with their specialists, because as you know, Trini's brand is all about personalization, and actually what they're able to do using technology is personalize your product selection using online sessions. And I think I just saw Trini the other day. That's working really well for her.
Yeah.
So I think Trini's done really well. Another brand I invest in is called Face Gym, which again is another, cosmetics concept where they have shops that work out your face muscles and then have product to accentuate that. And they've built out, they must be at 10 or 12 locations now. But again, the online, where the pandemic has forced pivots, I think it's pushed ways of thinking and approaching the business model differently, which ultimately I think will end up being positive for those businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you're involved with was it a Facing History on Ourselves, which is is it a charity or something, or support?
It is. It's a not-for-profit organization whose mission is really around giving kids. I like to just think about it as giving kids tools for judgment. So we live. I think we used to live in a world of 60 Minutes, which was a great TV show when I was growing up, which was in-depth, thoughtful approaches to problems. And we now live in a 60-character world, which has none of those things. And Facing History is all about, we give teachers case studies about human behavior, and they use those case studies and tools and materials to inform their kids about human behavior and identity. And so, which is why what we do is we use history and moments in history, whether it be civil rights, the Holocaust, other moments in history, other forms of literature, to understand human behavior, mostly human behavior around racism, intolerance, and bigotry, to help kids understand why people form those kinds of attitudes towards others, because I'm a big believer nobody was born racist, and help them understand that through the lens of history to inform their views as to who they are as citizens today. And so we work with teachers who work with mostly 14 to 16-year-old kids. And we try and empower those young people to understand that they have agency, and that their behavior and their attitudes and how those attitudes lead to action really can make a difference as to whether you are a perpetrator, which most people aren't, or a bystander, which is passive, and actually in history most people are, and then how to change someone from being a passive bystander that allows or can allow things to happen to others into becoming what we call an upstander. And so we create an environment to help kids become upstanders, and that's really what Facing History is about.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing cause. As a history graduate myself, I think teaching history is so important, because you've got to look. You kind of got to look in the wing mirror, in the wind, to sort of see through the windscreen, and you know what I mean. You've got that you've got to see those patterns and understand why things are the way they are, so you can build a better future. Surely. So
and the pedagogy is really about. I think there's two ways of thinking about history. You could think about history and a job of a history teacher as teaching facts: what happened, when, how many people died, what were the results, or the why, which is how did that history happen? Why did that history happen? And what can we learn about that to inform our decisions today? And the latter is really where Facing History, how it looks at the world.
No, absolutely. So, okay, so I wanted to end on this one, Ryan. I appreciate we're coming up towards the allocated time now. It's a really difficult economy at the moment. It's going to, there's a lot of companies on life support machines, and when the furlough scheme ends, there's going to be a lot of turmoil certainly in the employment market. We could be facing double figures unemployment over the next couple of months. And not that we want to build too much of a gloomy picture. I'd see it as a sea change as opposed to a disaster. I think things are just going to modernize and accelerate, like we talked about. But my question to you is this: you've been involved in business, you've been very successful for a long time. You've invested in multiple, companies and ventures. And I know this is a very generalist question because every venture is different. But what sort of generic advice would you give to small companies, to business owners, over this next, couple of months when they're going to experience a difficult marketplace?
So, I think there's two kinds of entrepreneurs in the world, and I think I fall into one of those two categories. There are some who are shoot for the stars. How do I turn this into the next Apple or Microsoft? And there's no point in starting a business unless it can be that. And actually, if you look at the whole WeWork saga, I think the whole SoftBank investment philosophy was don't bother unless you can turn this into $100 billion company. I think that's a form of entrepreneurialism. I actually come from a place that says there's a place for lots of great business in the world that can do good and be profitable. And a business can make £500,000 or £1 million a year or more and be worthwhile and valid and valuable to the person who started it, even at those levels. So that's my general disposition. And so in that vein, I really think in today's world, you need to take the most cautious approach that you can take. This is a survival mode moment. And I think that if your business can survive where we are now, you will be in a position to thrive when we come out for lots of reasons. And so now is the time to figure out what is the thing you do best that people want and are willing to pay for, and how can you form a model for the moment that looks out the next 6 to 18 months that will allow you to survive and position yourself to thrive.
Brilliant advice. That's great. Thanks for that, Ryan. I'm sorry if I can bolt on another question as well. What sort of books, stories, things have you been inspired by recently over this lockdown period?
So there's one book that I read at least once a year for the last 10 years of my life. It's a very famous book. It's written by a man called Viktor Frankl, who's a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And the first half of the book is about his experience in surviving the Holocaust. And the second half is him as a psychoanalyst and his philosophy around psychoanalysis. And his basic philosophy in life is the secret to happiness, the secret to man's search for meaning is your attitude to your situation. His philosophy is that whatever happens to you, no matter how dire the circumstances, and he obviously speaks from experience that doesn't get much more dire, that the thing you control in your life that no one can take away from you is your attitude to your circumstance, whatever that may be. And if you can find a way to have a positive attitude and look at what you have versus what you don't have, no matter what that circumstance may be, that there is light and optimism and opportunity in that. And so that's my favorite book.
That's fantastic. Do you know what? I smiled when you said that because I've been recommended that elsewhere and I downloaded it onto my Audible account, but I've not got around to listening to it yet. So I'm going to listen to it now. Well, look, thanks for your time, Ryan. I know you're a very busy chap, so I really, really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Happy to do it. And hope all goes well for you with the podcast. I think it's a great idea, and I hope it continues to be more and more successful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate it.